Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds, written by Adrienne Marie Brown, read by Sen Naomi Kirst-Schultz, August 17th, 2002. Introduction, Part 2. Together, we must move like waves. Have you observed the ocean? The waves are not the same over and over. Each one is unique and responsive. The goal is not to repeat each other's motion, but to respond in whatever way feels right in your body. The waves we create are both continuous and a one-time occurrence. We must notice what it takes to respond well, how it feels to be in a body, in a whole, separate, aligned, cohesive, critically connected. I would call our work to change the world science-fictional behavior, being concerned with the way our actions and beliefs now today will shape the future, tomorrow, the next generations. We are excited by what we can create. We believe it is possible to create the next world. We believe. For me, this might be because I was born to a Trekkie, meaning one who watches Star Trek obsessively. My dad watched Star Trek in a way that seems logical to me now. He watched this post-racist narrative as black man from the deep south, bringing multiracial children into a racist world. Eyes wide, faith bubbling up. We all watched it together as his military career took our family from place to place. My parents intentionally took us away from the United States for our early years, and I think they believed that by the time we came back here, things would have changed on the race front. That didn't happen, and the time came to return to the U.S. My father was stationed in Georgia. I think what I experienced there, the casual and constant presence of white supremacy, the knee-jerk assessments of my intelligence and humanity, is one of the foundational catalysts for my study of sci-fi, apocalypse and post-apocalypse, emergence, and complexity. I thought then, and I think now, this can't be all. No one survives this way, not long-term. This can't be the purpose of our species, to constantly identify each other as quote-unquote other. To build walls between us and engage in both formal and informal wars against each other's bodies. I felt and feel miraculous. It's confusing to feel so miraculous when so many people hate my skin and my history. I see the miraculous in others, even those who hate me have heartbeats, and I generally assume have people that they love. Why can't they love me? Should I love them anyway? How can I hold these massive contradictions? I started reading sci-fi obsessively, looking for options for other worlds where I wasn't dismissed as an idealist or an inferior. On that path, I discovered Octavia Butler. Decades before my birth, she was working these same edges in her heart, pendulum swinging between curiosity, possibility, and hopelessness. Because if we can't articulate more viable futures and adapt, our human future is pretty hopeless. Octavia wrote novels with young black women protagonists, meeting aliens, surviving the apocalypse, evolving into vampires, becoming telepathic networks, time-traveling to reckon with slave-owning ancestors. Woven throughout her work are two things. One, a coherent visionary exploration of humanity, and two, emergent strategies for being better humans. A visionary exploration of humanity includes imagination. Octavia spent her life working through complex ideas of the future on behalf of humans. As long as we operate in time the way we currently do, remembering the past, observing and acting in the present, imagining the future, there will be divergent paths that are moving in and out of alignment, in and out of conflict. Imagination is shaped by our entire life experience, our socialization, the concepts we are exposed to, where we fall in the global hierarchies of society. Our ideas of right and wrong shift with time. Right now, it's clear to me that something is wrong if it hurts this planet. But if we don't claim the future, that sense of loyalty to Earth, of environmentalism, could become outdated. Kenny Bailey helped me understand this. That justice, rights, things we take for granted are not permanent. Once there were kings and queens all over Earth, and someday we might speak of presidents and CEOs in past tense only. It is so important that we fight for the future, get into the game, get dirty, get experimental. How do we create and proliferate a compelling vision of economies and ecologies that center humans and the natural world over the accumulation of material? We embody, we learn, we release the idea of failure because it is all data. But first, we imagine. We are in an imagination battle. Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown and Renisha McBride and so many others are dead because in some white imagination, they were dangerous. And that imagination is so respected that those who kill based on an imagined racialized fear of black people are rarely held accountable. Imagination has people thinking they can go from being poor to a millionaire as part of a shared American dream. Imagination turns brown bombers into terrorists and white bombers into mentally ill victims. Imagination gives us borders, gives us superiority, gives us race as an indicator of capability. I often feel I am trapped inside someone else's imagination, and I must engage my own imagination in order to break free. All of this imagining in the poverty of our current system is heightened because of scarcity economics. There isn't enough, so we need to hoard, enclose, divide, fence up, and prioritize resources and people. We have to imagine beyond those fears. We have to ideate, imagine, and conceive together. We must imagine new worlds that transition ideologies and norms so that no one sees black people as murderers or brown people as terrorists and aliens, but all of us as potential cultural and economic innovators. This is a time travel exercise for the heart. This is collaborative ideation. What are the ideas that will liberate all of us? The more people that collaborate on that ideation, the more that people will be served by the resulting worlds. Science fiction is simply a way to practice the future together. I suspect that is what many of you are up to, practicing futures together, practicing justice together, living into new stories. It is our right and responsibility to create a new world. What we pay attention to grows. I'm thinking about how we grow what we are all imagining and creating into something large enough and solid enough that it becomes a tipping point. Ursula Le Guin recently said, "It's up to authors to spark the imagination of their readers and to help them envision alternatives to how we live." I agree with her. As Tony Cade Bambara has taught us, we must make just and liberated futures irresistible. We are all the protagonists of what might be called the Great Turning, the change, the new economy, the new world. And I think it is healing behavior to look at something so broken and see the possibility and wholeness in it. That's how I work as a healer. When a body is between my hands, I let wholeness pour through. We are all healers too. We are creating possibilities because we are seeing a future full of wholeness. I suspect this is in part because we are practicing emergent strategies. My mentor, Grace Lee Boggs, first raised the concept of emergence with us in Detroit after reading Margaret Wheatley's work about biomimicry and mycelium magic. Grace started asking us what our movements would look like if we focused on critical connections instead of critical mass. We need each other. I love the idea of shifting from mile-wide, inch-deep movements to inch-wide, mile-deep movements that schism the existing paradigm. Now, I have said what emergence is. Strategy is a military term, simply meaning a plan of action towards a goal. In our movements for social change, and in every other space I've ever been in, we generally use the word strategy in a positive sense. We say, "Oh wow, she or he or they are so strategic." And we mean that this person is smart, calculating, practical, a winner. But the word is actually not that discerning. Horrible, racist, sexist, ableist, patriarchal, outdated, inflexible plans can be pitched as strategic. We must be more precise. Emergent strategies are ways for humans to practice complexity and grow the future through relatively simple interactions. This juxtaposition of emergence and strategy was what made the most sense to me when I was trying to explain the kind of leadership I see in Octavia's books. It isn't just that her protagonists are black, female, or young leaders, or maybe it is because of all those things. Who leads matters. But what I noticed is that her leaders are adaptive, riding change like dolphins ride the ocean. Adaptive but also intentional, like migrating birds who know how to get where they're going, even when a storm pushes them 100 miles off course. Humans, some of us are surviving, following, flocking, but some of us are trying to imagine where we are going as we fly, and that is radical imagination. Octavia's protagonists were also interdependent, often polyamorous. I suspect that Octavia understood from her own feelings of loneliness, desire, and pleasure that the personal is political, and that pleasure evokes change. Perhaps more so than shame. More precisely, where shame makes us freeze and try to get really small and invisible, pleasure invites us to move, to open, to grow. At this point, we have all of the information we need to create a change. It isn't a matter of facts. It's a matter of longing, having the will to imagine and implement something else. We are living in the ancestral imagination of others, with their longing for safety and abundance, a longing that didn't include us, or included us as an enemy, fright, or other. Octavia played with what emerged from a black woman or girl, what longings, what pleasure, what communities, what connections, what philosophies and divinities. The strategies that played out in Octavia's books included adaptability and interdependence, often through the practice of repeated vulnerability. Right now, there is an organization called Black Organizing for Leadership and Dignity, BOLD, which is cultivating a safe space for Black leaders to practice being vulnerable, being in mutual support with the goal of countering the usual model of leader isolation. We all need a place where we can weep and be held and feel our feelings and figure out how those feelings can direct our next evolution. I am now part of the training team for BOLD, and I can honestly say that after a period of movement heartbreak and disillusionment, the focus on love and relationship at BOLD is what brought me back to justified and tangible hope, opening up inside me the generosity of time and gifts that is necessary for movement to grow. I wanted to be a part of movement again because it was a pleasure to be in the Black spaces that BOLD was creating. What amazes me is that in the space of such constant Black trauma, we get together and celebrate and love on each other. We laugh, we find the pleasure of community, of interdependence. It feels good together. Octavia's leaders were also decentralized and they were generative. Resilience and solutions came from that decentralization. The collective response was possible because no one person held the power. Ferguson, Baltimore, Minneapolis, Chicago show us the power of individuals willing to act without a single leader, and their leaderful examples are inspiring others to stand up in real time, offline and online, to change legislation and perception. Octavia was concerned with scale, understanding that what happens at the interpersonal level is a way to understand the whole of society. In many of her books, she shows us how radical ideas spread through conversation, through questions, one-to-one interactions. Social movements right now are also fractal, practicing at a small scale what most want to see at the universal level. No more growth or scaling up before actually learning through experience. Rather than narrowing into one path forward, Octavia's leaders were creating more and more possibilities, not one perfect path forward, but an abundance of futures, of ways to manage resources together, to be brilliant together. In trying to place Octavia into a context that non-sci-fi people could understand, I kept finding resonance in emergence and complex sciences, the ideas that Grace had brought onto my radar. I started to pay more attention to the magic of the world, the small collective creatures who were humble and abundant and resilient. And now I have become obsessed with how we can be movements like flocks of birds, underground power like whispering mushrooms, the seashell representation of a galactic vision for justice, small patterns that avoid useless predation, that spread lessons and proliferate change. Emergent strategies let us practice in every possible way the world that we want to see. So, okay, but what exactly is emergent strategy? Emergent strategy was initially a way of describing the adaptive and relational leadership model found in the work of Black science fiction writer Octavia Butler and others. Then, it grew into plans of action, personal practices, and collective organizing tools that account for constant change and rely on the strength of a relationship for adaptation, with a crush on biomimicry and permaculture, which evolved into strategies for organizers building movements for justice and liberation that leverage relatively simple interactions to create complex pattern systems and transformations, including adaptation, interdependence, and decentralization, fractal awareness, resilience, and transformative justice, nonlinear and iterative change creates more possibilities. And now, it's like ways for humans to practice being in right relationship to our home and each other, to practice complexity and grow a compelling future together through relatively simple interactions. Emergent strategy is how we intentionally change in ways that grow our capacity to embody the just and liberated worlds that we long for. And maybe, if I'm honest, it's a philosophy for how to be in harmony and love in and with the world. A complex movement. Over and over again, it becomes known. The peace we seek is seeking us. The joy a full bud, awaiting our attention, justice in our hands, longing to be practiced. The whole world learning from within this thrilling mote in the universe. Laboratory, labyrinth, internalized demands. You are the one you are waiting for. Externalized love. Bind us together into a greater self, a complex movement, a generative abundance, an embodied evolution. Learn to be here. Critique is a seductress. Her door is always open, so what if you get some? We are going further, past reform, to wonder. This requires comprehension that cannot fit in words, out beyond our children. Beyond the end of time, there is a ceaseless cycle, a fractal of sublime, and we come to create it, to soil our hands and faces, loving, and loving ourselves and all our places. Lineage of Emergent Strategy. Lineage is both important for me to name and impossible to track. I've come across these concepts in so many ways and places, primarily in the natural world, in my own body, in the development of my nibblings, in movements, including the movement for Black Lives and Occupy, in stories of how my paternal grandmother survived and created life in Pendleton, South Carolina, in stories of how my ancestors survived slavery. Every time I have worked with indigenous communities that have been able to sustain their cultural practices through the onslaught of colonialism and imperialism. As I listen, I hear emergent strategy, being in right relationship with the natural world, learning from the ways change and resilience happen throughout this entire interconnected, complex system. Some Indigenous and First Nations friends and teachers have patiently listened to my discoveries around being humble in the face of the unknown, listening closely to all that is within and beyond our human ways of knowing, honoring the changes that come through longing, honoring the very small things that create the largest shifts in the world. I am the first child of two people who created a large shift for themselves from small actions of love, weighted with the context of their time, a Black man and white woman, finding lifelong, life-changing commitment in the context of white supremacy and racism, external and internal. And it was quick. A noticing each other, a flirting without words, talking, laughing, and 4 months later eloping. I showed up a year and a half later. Love overcame racist socialization, creating more possibilities between two people who had been taught that the other was dangerous. After family, there's a certain convergence of thinkers and conversations that has sharpened this particular set of concepts into something I could name and share. Most of this particular lineage happened on worn-down couches and over kitchen tables in Detroit from 2008 to 2014. In 1992, Margaret Wheatley published a book called Leadership and the New Science, based on her work with organizations and leaders on what is effective through a lens of quantum physics, biology, and chaos theory. Her key learnings were that everything is about relationships and critical connections. Chaos is an essential process that we need to engage. The sharing of information is fundamental for organizational success, and vision is an invisible field that binds us together, emerging from relationships and chaos and information. Wheatley has continued developing her thinking on how transformation happens, how communities learn and evolve. She has published a series of books in which she explores and shares her learning, including how we listen to each other and what communities around the world are doing to generate life, to generate cooperation and future together. When we met and worked together on a gathering of organizers in Detroit, I got the sense that she's a little over leadership, so I encourage you to read it for the references. It's a foundational text, and then read everything else that she is working on. Grace Lee Boggs, Detroit-based American revolutionary, my late mentor and friend, read Leadership and began to incorporate some of the ideas into speeches in her own writing in the last decade of her 100-year, 100-day life. As a thinker, I would say Grace was a voracious, efficient beast, and philosophy was her hunting ground. She stayed curious and relevant until the end, asking metaphysical questions on her deathbed. And she was usually ahead of her time. She was creating visionary fiction with Bunyan Bryant in the 1970s. During the years of our mentorship and friendship, Grace would sit in her armchair and encourage everyone who came through her doors to develop as an organic intellectual who could take these concepts into daily life and community work. Grace taught me dialectical humanism, the cycle of collective transformation of beliefs that occurs as we gather new information and experiences, meaning that, over time, we can understand and hold a position that we previously believed to be wrong. In Grace's work, that cycle of transformation was foundational, something to cultivate in young people, in communities. In addition, she resonated with Wheatley's idea that critical connections are more important in a long-term transformation process than critical mass. Relationships are everything. Invincible Ill Weaver, a Detroit-based artist-organizer, heard about the book and concepts from Grace and became a student of Emergence, naming their music and media work after the concept and generating an award-winning multimedia interactive album project called Complex Movements around these and other concepts at the intersection of complex science and social justice. I was reading Black science fiction writer Octavia Butler's work over and over during that time. I was also visiting and eventually moving to Detroit, in large part due to my relationship with Ill. As I've mentioned, I was looking for language and frameworks to use when exploring the kind of leadership Butler's protagonists practice and found them in conversations with Ill and Grace about emergence, interdependence, iteration, being in relationship with constantly changing conditions, fractals. Emergence, particularly as it applies to change, was a thrilling match. Ill and I now have a work soulmateship. They are family, a chosen sibling, an idea confidant. Detroit's movement and art scenes are actually a complex network of such familial relationships, cultivated through sharing resources, loving the city, and conversing as we learn together. I am a nomad who also feels rooted here because of this network. Wheatley's work speaks of relationship. The depth of relationship between the individuals in a system determines the strength of the system. Butler, Wheatley, Ill, Grace, myself, and many others have been growing a strong system of relationships for considering emergence as a game-changing approach to movement work. Okay, but who are you? Right. I'm Adrienne Marie Brown. I'm an auntie, a sister, daughter, woe, writer, facilitator, coach, mentor, mediator, pleasure activist, sci-fi scholar, doula, healer, tarot reader, witch, cheerleader, singer, philosopher, queer, black, multiracial lover of life, living in Detroit. For this book, I am drawing most heavily on my facilitation, mediation, and coaching experiences. I have been facilitating social justice movement work formally since 2001, and before that, in high school and college, I did student organizing in which I often found myself in what I later came to understand as the facilitation role. Inside of that work, I have been asked to mediate everything from organizational beef to breakups, and have coached people through personal and professional transformation along the way. I have supported environmental, food, reproductive, gender, economic, and other justice work over the years. At times, I worked formally in organizations that do harm reduction work with active drug users and sex workers, voter organizing at the national level, food justice work in Detroit, and nonviolent direct action training, primarily supporting Indigenous peoples and other communities directly impacted by climate crisis. I also supported the Second U.S. Social Forum as a facilitator. I've held a variety of titles from assistant to coordinator to executive director. In each movement location, I felt inspired by how people can come together for something greater than ourselves, and I felt a yearning for more. Throughout this path of my jobs, I was always facilitating within and beyond the organizations I served. At its most fundamental, facilitation is the art of making things easy, making it easier for humans to work together and get things done. Quote, "There is a difference between simple and easy. Simple as in the relatively simple interactions of emergence, easy as in facilitation is the art of making things easy. I don't think they are the same, and I have a hunch the difference might be important, and that maybe it should be explicit. Simple means that it boils down to relationships between individual people, objects, beings, truths. Ease has more to do with the amount of friction or understanding between the people, objects, beings, truths. And part of what can clear a path to making things easier is to name the simple interactions at play in a complex system." Unquote. Rachel Plattis. I think facilitation is rooted in a certain grand love for life. I've recently realized that I come from a family of facilitators, though everyone wouldn't describe themselves that way. As I mentioned, my parents are an interracial couple who fell in love in the Deep South in the mid-70s. I am sure I will write their love story one day, but for the purpose of this book, it's mostly important to know that both of them had to be able to see something impossible based on the families and society they had been born into, as not only a possible way forward, but as the best way forward. In their family, work, and community roles over the years, both my parents have shown natural capacity for leading groups, organizing tasks, making things easier for those around them. They have navigated a wide range of political and economic difference in our extended family. I have two sisters, both of whom I look to as teachers and confidants. We are each very different, and yet we all seem to be oriented towards facilitation, consensus, and mediation work. In our lifetimes, being multiracial has become more common, but navigating other people's regressive, fearful, or exoticizing ideas about our identities is one of the ways each member of my immediate family grew this skill set of being able to see what is between, what connects the things that seem separate, the ever-present whole. I also have to speak here of my evangelical maternal grandfather, Fred Mathis, who facilitated many conversations about Jesus, morality, spirit, faith, and love in his lifetime. Every single time I was in his presence, I was amazed at how quickly we were in a conversation of his choosing where he was really listening to my child thoughts about God and love and duty, where I felt I could be honest, even with my doubts, even with my heart. We often differed in opinion, which with him felt safe and even invited in a way that it wasn't and hadn't been with most other Southern white people. We would talk, and then he would get me on a horse and take me to the woods, asking me intermittently if I understood how powerful the horse was, how beautiful the land was. Though he was not a fan of my queer sexuality, the only letter I have from him includes scripture and sadness in response to my somewhat impetuous but accurate assertion that I like to sleep with everybody. He let me come back to his table, and before he left this plane, we created room to recognize each other's humanity and spirituality. I came to understand his fears were rooted in love for me and concern for my eternal soul. He came to understand I was going to find my own way, and that I loved him and was living a life he couldn't imagine. I learned from him the art of conversation, faith, and silence. My paternal grandmother, Eloise Brown, died when I was 9. One of my clearest secret memories is that I saw her impossibly on a playground shortly before I learned of her death. As I get older, I think part of her came to me to be carried for a while. I have felt her with me so closely. Most of her lessons have been passed down to me through stories about her, patched together with sparse, deep memories of her hands in my hair. Her door was always open. There was something to eat. The neighborhood kids knew they could come open her deep freezer for a popsicle. She had 7 children of her own. From her, I learned that food is an important foundation for community, and that love isn't always a doorway to forever. Sometimes it is a door to another love. Always, it is an emergent process. Among other things, love is an energy of possibility, the possibility of wholeness, in a Platonic understanding. I come from a lineage of brave and radical love, and I don't think it is an accident that love has been such an overt and active force in my life, and that I have come to the conclusion that there is a science of love, a science of transformation and acceptance and gratitude that can help us to be better humans. So I will draw on that love experience as data as much as any other data presented in this book. Below are some of the other aspects of who I am in this lineage and what shapes the content gathered here. Pleasure activist. I picked up this term from harm reductionist Keith Seilar, who I met only briefly before he passed on April 5th, 2004, after 20 years of living with HIV. Initially, pleasure activism was about claiming our right to experience pleasure, to be safe and respected in the pleasures that we choose. It has expanded for me over the years as I have come to believe that facts, guilt, and shame are limited motivations for creating change, even though those are the primary forces we use in our organizing work. I suspect that to really transform our society, we will need to make justice one of the most pleasurable experiences we can have. We also have to stop demonizing pleasure. We try to leverage control over the natural world by making our emotions and sensations less reliable than our thoughts, and then burn at the stake anyone who stays attuned to the ways and power of pleasure in the natural world. It's counterproductive. Audre Lorde's essay, The Uses of the Erotic, is foundational writing on the radical act of tuning into pleasure and not settling for less than the erotic sense of wholeness and rightness in one's life. She is my ancestor in the lineage of this particular work, and many others. I will speak many times of BOLD, the leadership development for Black organizers that is one of my favorite political homes. What we do there is turn and face reality, engage in deep relationship, and love up on each other. It is an organizing space that is also a maroon space, and it is always a pleasure to enter. Every member of BOLD is a teacher of mine. What we pay attention to grows. This is a hard world, but it is also a world full of love and pleasure. I am of that, attending to and growing that. That, to me, is pleasure activism. I am pretty certain that the next book I write will be on pleasure activism. Healer and doula. We all have the capacity to heal each other. Healer is a possibility in each of us. In my experience, healing happens when a place of trauma or pain is given full attention and really listened to. Healing is the resilience instinct of our bodies, a skill we unlearn as we are taught to pay for and rely on data and medicine outside of our own awareness to be well. I have been discovering or surrendering to my gifts as a healer. There is a way I can open up my presence, voice, and touch to an energy greater than what my body or life has given me. Then, truth, comfort, ease, release, and other healing experiences can flow through. Wholeness and acceptance of what is can be felt. I've studied Reiki, massage, somatic bodywork, voice healing, tarot, and witchcraft as I have felt my healer capacity emerge. I place doula here because the work feels the same. A doula or birth supporter is specifically a person who supports a pregnant person before, during, and after childbirth. The role was traditionally held by women in the family or community, often working with a midwife or doctor in the process. Childbirth these days is one of the clearest examples of humans working against nature, hence the norms of sterile medicated hospital births with a drastic increase in scheduled inductions and unnecessary C-sections. I learned of these trends away from natural birth when my sister Autumn started having her babies, and she taught me a ton with her choices. I've been asked several times to be a doula and kept saying no because blood and the proximity of the words, quote, vagina and tear didn't feel like it was going to work for me. Then a woman was attacked with a hammer behind my apartment while I was living in Oakland, and I was the first to find her and comfort her as she bled and struggled to stay conscious. I saw her strength and aliveness and held it with her until the ambulance came. When she came to thank me a week later, we spoke of how we had created a future for her together. After that experience, and inspired by Autumn, I said yes the next time I was asked to become a doula, learning as an apprentice to Cynthia Jackson in Detroit. Eventually, I got to be present for the birth of Autumn's third child and be part of her support during the miscarriage of her fourth child. Life and death are transitions that want to be held gently. I have now been a doula and birth supporter for several births. The final read-through of this book was actually delayed because a dear friend brought a perfect little one into the world, and I was her doula and could not look away from the first weeks of that precious being's life. Beyond birth, I have found doula to be a role that applies to many aspects of life. Birth work teaches us to engage tension, but not to indulge drama. It is another form of facilitation, making the miraculous experience of birth as easy as possible, intervening with any systems that make the process harder, helping the family attend to each other and listen to what the body is saying, staying focused on the possibility and wisdom of the body. Standing or sitting with someone as they remember their own wholeness. That is the work of the healer and the doula. My healing work is just pushing back the external world, making more space for people to feel themselves. Detroit musician, spiritual teacher, friend Sterling Tolles told me he considers himself a, quote, dressing room where people can try on their most authentic selves, end quote. And this has been a guiding visual for me when I am engaged in my healing work. As he said in the opening of the 2016 Allied Media Conference, it's okay to feel beautiful in the process of creating justice. Writer and artist. My mom says writing came first, and it certainly has been the most consistent kind of work I have done in my life. Writing, creating, drawing, singing. I am better at some forms of creating than others, but I enjoy all of it. And I have to write in some form every day. It's how I understand the world. Toni Cade Bambara, a Black feminist writer-organizer who left lots of wisdom for us, said two things that I turn to when I start to wonder if art is enough of a contribution. On one hand, as I referenced earlier, she said, quote, "The role of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible," end quote. On the other hand, she said that, quote, "Writing is one of the ways I participate in transformation," end quote. From this wisdom combination, I see that I am charged to write about the revolutions I long for, and that any writing I do, even if it isn't explicitly political, is still a transformative act. I apply this to my songs, my self-portraits, my poems, understanding that when a Black, queer, thick artist woman intentionally takes up space, it creates a new world. Independent science and visionary fiction scholar. I read sci-fi and visionary fiction as a political, sacred, and philosophical text, and I engage with others who read it that way. I spent the first part of my life learning what history's victors wanted to tell me to believe about the past, including the simple assumption that it was the past. I see massive patterns of violence and inequality in history which perpetuate in the daily news. Science fiction, particularly visionary fiction, is where I go when I need the medicine of possibility applied to the trauma of human behavior. While I have done deep dives in the work of Samuel Delany, Ursula Le Guin, and others, I started this scholarship in earnest with Octavia. She presented perspectives on the future that were terrifying and compelling, and she took my breath away with her ideas for how to navigate change. She said, "All that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change." If we accept the scientific and science-fictional premise that change is a constant condition of this universe, then it becomes important that we learn to be in right relationship with change. After much deliberation, I have opted not to include a bunch of Butler analysis and spoilers in this book. Her work is incredibly strong and clear. If you haven't read it, feel free to put this book down and go read everything she wrote, and then pick this back up. Warning, I reference her constantly and casually in these pages as if you have also read the work and know what I am talking about. That's true of almost everyone I reference. This book is not about analyzing other people's books or work. If you want more, go read the people and books I reference and then consume the works they reference. I want to move forward from where others ended, or at least from the point of impact between their work and my own. So Wheatley, Boggs, Butler, my family, my passions, all of these are teachers of emergence for me. I have also been impressed and developed by the speeches of biomimicry teacher Janine Benyus, the mycelium mushroom scholar Paul Stamets, the organizing model of Ella Baker, the Toltec worldview presented in the Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz, and the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu, particularly the interpretations of Stephen Mitchell and Le Guin. I have learned that feeling matters, that feeling is an important and legitimate way of knowing. This learning has come most formally through somatics, particularly the social justice and somatics blend found in generative somatics through the work of Stacey Haynes, Spenta Kandawala, Liu Hoyman, Lisa Thomas Adeyemo, Chris Limbertos, Vasilisa Jory, and Richard Strozzi Heckler, and Robert Gass's work on the art of transformation now developing and evolving into emergent strategies at the Social Transformation Project under the leadership of Jody Tonita, Eugene Kim, Edelise Malave, and others. And Star Wars, The Force, William Gibson Idoru, China Miyevel, Dream Shit, Nalo Hopkinson, Sensual Breathtaking Magic, The Zapatistas, Many Worlds Exist, The Black Panthers Meet the Biological Needs of a Community as a Mode of Organizing, Black feminist artists Audre Lorde, June Jordan, Lucille Clifton, and Toni Cade Bambara create as a form of revolution, Gloria Anzaldúa, and many more. Early on in my exploration of this kind of work, Marianne Manilov and Alyssa Hauser, network cultivators, invited me to hold a year of community practice with the Engage Network. They and the participants in that year-long journey were also teachers: Anasa Troutman, Carrie Kelly, Jenny Lee, Jody Tonita, Jane Sungibai, Gibran Rivera, Mike Norman, Jidan Kun, and Navina Khanna. Thank you. I also held a transformative phone-based community practice for a year after a creative change gathering in Utah. It had some very vulnerable and beautiful emergent elements to it that taught me about curating soil that is fertile for relationship building. And then there are all the other incredible people whose voices are woven throughout this book and online appendix. They each taught me something about emergent strategy, and there are many more teachers whose voices are not in this book. I think that the best I can do on explicit lineage, feel free to remind me of anything I missed. Basically, I see emergence everywhere, and I feel positively obsessed with the possibilities of being awake to it. Without positive obsession, there is nothing at all. Octavia Butler. This has been the introduction to Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds, written by Adrienne Marie Brown, read by Sen Naomi Kirst-Schultz. Thanks for reading.